aquí, pues le cedemos la palabra. Gracias.
Okay, gracias. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, hopefully everyone can see. See that.
Sí.
Okay, muy bien. Okay, so thank you all for the invitation to be here today. I'm really excited to talk about my ongoing area of research, which is focusing on no sabo kids and the perceptions of no sabo kids across different types of contexts. So I'll be presenting today preliminary work that comes from a survey with university heritage students about their initial experiences and what they think of the core definitions of quote unquote what is a no sabo kid. So for those of us who are not familiar with this label, it's been one that's been circulating in the United States over the last couple of years, and it's at most basic usage. It's to refer to U.S. Hispanics who are not fluent in Spanish, do not speak it perfectly, quote unquote, or do not speak it at all. And this is the latest iteration of a long line of racial linguistic labels that denigrate the practices of U.S. bilinguals, thinking specifically of words like mucho y pocho. So it seems to be the case that this is just the next iteration of this tradition. So the reason why research is kind of focused on no Sawa is one is kind of iconic, or the research is starting to see that it's iconic representation of this group, allegedly how they're supposed to speak. So, for example, if you can imagine a younger Hispanic who may or may not speak Spanish, they're addressed in Spanish and they respond back with a no sabo, which indicates on a couple of different levels, a couple of different things. So, one, it's an over-regularization of the form saber in the first person singular form. In the present tense, say, it's an over-regularization of that. That's frequently found in child language acquisition. You have the no there that indicates negation. So in this case, it indicates a lack of knowledge coming from the verb saber. And it's very much associated with younger speakers and those who are the second sociolinguistic generation or later. However, more recent media reports, although it's been using kind of as a way to ethno-linguistically gatekeep identity within the Hispanic communities, or at least that's one of the usages of it. More recent media reports point to its possible reclamation within this community. Um, so to kind of contextualize what I'm going to be presenting today, I do want to give kind of a shout out and kind of a preview of what's to come, and that is that Salvatore Cayetano and I are co-editing a special issue of No Sabo Kids for the International Journal of the Sociology of Language. And here are a couple different papers that are going to hopefully be on the issue. It still has to pass through peer review, and our contributors will be submitting papers in June. So hopefully by next year it'll be published. But here is a couple of the things that are being looked at that you can see here. So like the second to last one, for example, this is what I was talking about earlier, this use of no sabo from pejorative to reappropriation reclamation within people who identify as no sabo kids. And then you can see the other types of topics there. For today, our paper is going to be focused on, so this is collaborative work with Salvatore Cayetano, and our paper today is going to be an empirical, we're going to be presenting survey results that are going to serve as an empirical introduction to this special issue that examines the origins, initial experiences, and perceptual dynamics of this label. So these are some of the key questions that we're hoping to answer within this project. So how and why did this label emerge? How did it spread? What are its key components? And is this perception that participants have, is it mediated by different types of social factors? So taking into account the individual evaluator and how some sort of factors could influence how they perceive no sabo kids. So although it's been a term that's really blown up online on social media, it's in popular discourse, there's very few empirical work on no sabo kids. So the very first one by Stransky et al., they looked at 10 TikTok videos and kind of demonstrated how it's a linguistically negative term that's being used within Hispanic communities, specifically kind of focusing on online context. And then Sal also did a paper in 2023 that did a great analysis of 100 videos under the hashtag NoSaboKid. And within that paper, he argues that there are some sort of enregistered features. These are features associated with the label and how they're being used to perform NoSabo-ness, I guess you can say, online. So he identified code switching, English influenced lexical gap, like especially performative lexical gap, and that these people were somehow Americanized. And then in a paper I have forthcoming, which was just accepted into Language and Society, so I'm really excited about it. Hopefully it'll be on the next couple of months. But I do a discursive analysis of a language-focused episode of Caso Cerrado, the popular Telemundo show that does courtroom drama. So I think many of you guys are probably familiar with this clip, but this is the episode I analyzed to give you a sense of that.
Buenas tardes.
Hello. Good afternoon.
No, ningún afternoon y ningún hello.
I
No, ninguno. Aquí tú hablas español.
I,
Esto es un programa en español. Aquí se habla español.
But I don't-
Aquí nosotros no ponemos
I don't
letreritos.
feel comfortable
Y tú te llamas
talking in
Luna.
Spanish, yes.
Your name is not Moon. Okay.
well, it's not
Okay, so I did a discourse analysis of that episode, and what I argue for in this paper is that stylization is key to this. Stylization of language ideologies, and more specific, two different persona that are within U.S. Hispanic communities. On the one, we have a No Sabo kid who is being portrayed by Luna on the left here. It's a young girl who comes to the courtroom and she's refusing to speak in Spanish, although she does switch to Spanish in the episode, but you can definitely see, and I argue for in this paper, that some of the features that she employs are actually registered features of the No Sabo kid persona. And then on the right side, we have Ana Maria Polo, who's the host of the show, and she's portraying a Hispanic mother. She's trying to get somebody, in this case, a young girl, to speak only Spanish within her courtroom. So in this paper, I also interrogate this paradox that some people are using this label No Sabo kid and also language shaming to somehow promote these people to speak more Spanish, to promote the younger generation to increase their use of Spanish. So I kind of interrogate this paradox of if that's actually going to be the case. So going back to the origin of the label, so what's currently known by empirical research is that the two papers that have been published so far have suggested that it's something that has emerged on social media. And then the paper I'm just referencing, in the paper I present a timeline from Google Trends. So Google Trends is a tool that we have to be able to look at different search terms and kind of see when people were starting to make queries in Google. So as you can see here on this graph, that there were no search terms for No Sabo kid. Zero equals zero interest and 100 equals maximum search interest on Google. And as you can see, in November 2020, there was no search interest for No Sabo kid. And then it started to pick up, or the first, capture, how it was first captured online was in 2020, and then it seems to peak in November 2021. So it seems to be the case that people were doing a lot of searches for No Sabo kid during this very short period of time, actually less than a year, going from December 2020 to November 2021. And as we can also see from this graph, it has sustained search interest over time. It continues to be something that is searched for. Unlike some search terms, which you see a big spike in it and then it kind of dissipates. So slide, there we go. And as in terms of where No Sabo, this label is used, it seems to be primarily the case that it's used primarily in the United States. So as you can see by the search interest here, it's kind of localized here in the United States, which suggests that it's a US-based phenomenon. And then within the United States, you can see a map here of different types of search interest by geographic area. And you can see, perhaps not surprisingly, in the Southwest, where there are people who are of third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, et cetera, generation that may be labeled No Sabo. This seems to be the part of the country where the search interest is kind of really concentrated, although you can see it's also searched for in other parts as well. So in this paper, I mentioned, one of my arguments, my fundamental arguments, is that this episode of Caso Cerrado was likely a pivotal pop cultural moment in the diffusion of the No Sabo label. In this episode, according to knowyourmeme.com, which I know is a very reputable site, but it does a pretty good job of tracking internet memes. They mentioned that it started to go viral in early 2021, and this was exactly the same time, at least by the Google search trends, that this label was starting to be searched for online. So I argue that this episode contributed to the diffusion of the label, likely because it was the manifestation of a No Sabo kid on one hand and a Hispanic mother on the other hand who really wanted to promote language maintenance within her family. So that leads us to our research question. So as I mentioned, previous research has really documented the focus on how this label spread online. So we want to take a step back to see if it was specifically an internet-based phenomenon, or is it something that was circulating earlier before 2020, before TikTok became popular here in the United States, or if it's something that, just happened online. So the research questions for our study are: when did people initially encounter the No Sabo label? What were their initial experiences and reactions towards it? And for them, what are the core characteristics of the No Sabo label? So for our study, we have a 4-part survey that was distributed and is being distributed right now on Qualtrics. 4 different sections. So we have a diary-based questions, which basically gets at people to try to narrate the first encounter that they had with the term, whether that be online or whether that be in person. Try to get more details about who was involved in the conversation, who was who was targeted by using, who used the label, et cetera. And this is based on a study that looked at cross-cultural variation, the perceptions of impoliteness. In which participants wrote about a time in which someone said something that made them feel bad. So this part of the survey was inspired based on that study. We then have attitudinal questions that get at three different dimensions of language attitudes. We also include the bilingual language profile, which is a measurement that's being used to capture someone's language dominance, and in this case, either English or Spanish. Then we also use the Critical English Awareness Survey that was developed by Boudry and colleagues, which has been validated for Spanish heritage speakers. It's a global score that purports to get at somebody's level of critical awareness. That includes three different parts, for example, language variation, language presence, and English hegemony. Their attitudes towards bilingualism, Spanglish, and code switching, and then the third component, which has to do with their language maintenance. But overall, it gives a global score. So for completion time, the survey took about 20 to 40 minutes to complete, and participants were given $15 Tango rewards, which they can be used to buy gift cards from different types of vendors, like maybe like hundreds of different types of vendors. It's a really great online resource to be able to pay participants. So here are the diary questions. This was the first part of the survey. This was presented to all participants. So when was the first time you heard the term? Please provide the approximate year, because again, we kind of want to track when people first heard the term, to try to track the social linguistic awareness of it. Where did you hear it? Who was involved in the exchange? Describe everything that happened and everything that was said in the exchange, including who was called no sabo and how that person responded. Try to get at like the perceptions of no sabo kid in the moment. And then when you first heard it, what do you think it meant? So trying to see if people initially understood right away what it meant, or if it was something that they kind of had to have a little bit more context and a little bit more negotiation and discourse to be able to understand its full meaning. And then the last question, how did you feel about it and how you reacted to it? So try to get people's initial reactions to when they first heard the term. So here's some sample attitudinal questions. So for example, in the affective section, we had questions like, I think that no Sabo kids are not real Latinos. And I will say that this was on a scale from 1 to 5, a Likert scale. So 1 being strongly disagree to 5 being strongly agree. I think it's no Sabo kids' faults for being no Sabo kids. I think no Sabo kids are too assimilated into U.S. culture. And then for cognitive sections, some questions we had were no Sabo kids prefer to be friends with white people. They have poor pronunciation in Spanish, and they are intelligent. So trying to get at people's social cognition of what they think of when they think of the no Sabo kid label. And then finally, some behavioral questions to use the label. So for example, I would feel ashamed if a child of mine was a no Sabo kid. I would tell other people to stop calling another person a no Sabo. So these were some sort of here was an example of the behavioral questions that we had on the questionnaire. So participants, so far we have 171 undergraduate students who identify as Spanish heritage speakers who were recruited throughout the country through public institutions. So you can see the distribution here. Majority of them come from the Southwest, and then within that, majority of them come from Texas. Next would be the Midwest, and perhaps not surprisingly, because Sal also helped with the survey distribution. He's, his institution's the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. But then we also have participants from the South and also the Northeast. However, for this presentation, I'm going to be focusing specifically on the 82 participants from the Southwest. And you can see the regional distribution here. So we had 2 from Arizona, 15 from California, 13 from Colorado, 5 from Nevada, 2 from New Mexico, and 45 from Texas. And then you can also see you can also see their gender and age breakdown here. In terms of the BLP score, the range is from negative 218, which would indicate complete Spanish dominance, and 218, which would indicate complete English dominance. You can see within these participants on a whole, they tend to be more English dominant with a score of 40.58. Then in terms of critical awareness, so 1 being less critical awareness and 6 being more critical awareness, you can see that the participants on a whole had a moderately high level of critical awareness based on the reports, or based on the results from that survey that was included in the instrument. So for the quantitative analysis, so we ran an exploratory analysis using our psych package, multivariate regression with region, bilingual score, and critical language awareness score. So from this exploratory factor analysis with all the participants, I should mention this was all the participants, we identified 4 groupings. So these were the questions on the survey. They grouped around 4 different factors. And these are just preliminary labels, these factors. We've just done a preliminary analysis on this, so this is kind of like where our head is at in terms of labeling these things. So the first factor has to do with assimilation into whiteness or American identity. So this tries to get at, or this question, the questions that had to do with a racial component of the no salvo label, those questions were kind of centering around this first factor. They kind of grouped together. The second factor had to do with a lack of Spanish. So any question that had to do with a lack of Spanish proficiency, poor pronunciation, poor grammar, these questions center around the second factor. The third factor has to do with participants' individual evaluation about no sabo kids. So for example, if they perceive them to be intelligent, confident, sincere. And then the fourth factor had to do with their future behavior towards a no sabo kid. So for example, would they be ashamed if one of their kids was a no sabo kid? However, for this presentation, I'm going to be presenting some preliminary results from this larger project, but I'm also for this presentation going to be focusing on selected attitudinal questions with participants just from the Southwest that kind of show these overall trends that we're seeing throughout the data. And then for the qualitative analysis, we're trying to construct a timeline of when the term was first heard, its domain of use, participants' role in the conversation or the interaction, and also what was the motivation for somebody labeling somebody else a no sabo kid. And again, for this presentation, I'm going to be focusing specifically on results from the Southwest. Okay, so now getting into the results. So as you can see in this table, this is constructs the timeline of when people first, and again, this is self-reported data, right? This is when they first, the reports that first had heard the term no sabo. So as you can see, there was some circulation between 2010 and to 2015, but the first kind of moment where it started to really start to kind of pick up, as we can see, was between 2016 and 2017. And overall, our responses from the Southwest indicate that the majority of participants first reported hearing the term in person, which is kind of surprising considering that previous research has documented this as kind of like an online phenomenon. Well, at least our survey data is showing that people have reported that was circulating in in-person context before it made its way online. So you can see the first reported initial encounter in an online setting was in 2016. But perhaps not surprisingly, as previous research has shown, this was increased in 2020 and 2021. But I will say also the peak initial encounter was between 2016 and 2023, which accounts for about 88% of the data. So the domains of use. So basically what we're going to see in this presentation, so it says that 26 participants from the Southwest indicated that they heard it in online context. So this number is going to repeat and repeat and repeat. So we can see here on the right table, the domain of use that 34.7% of the participants, so that 26 participants, reported first hearing the no sabo label in social media. But as we can see here, actually, almost the majority of the usage was in school. So a majority of the participants, almost a majority of the participants, first reported hearing the no sabo label in school, with their peers and with their classmates. Some other uses, as you can see here, within family, service encounters, social events that took place outside of school, and also work. So to get at the participants' role, we decided to divvy up the data on as a way to try to sort things out by categorizing the role that the participant had within the particular interaction. So within this, we had 4 different levels. So we have the target. So this was the participant themselves. They were called no sabo. So their first exposure to the no sabo label was them being called no sabo. We also have bystanders, and then this is the case that participants were involved in the interaction, and then within the interaction, somebody else called somebody else a no sabo kid. So this is like firsthand experience. They're actually seeing it being negotiated within discourse, like right in front of them. For general conversation, this was when a participant was part of a conversation, but nobody involved was directly called a no sabo kid. So for example, they were things like, hey, that kid over there that's sitting at the other lunch table, oh, he's a no sabo kid, or kind of like a more metalinguistic commentary that some participants reported hearing no sabo label the very first time in a Spanish class, when there was like a discussion about what are no sabo kids and how this label is being used. So those types of situations fell under general conversation. And then of course, social media, their first exposure to it was online. So as we can see here, the results point to, at least for the Southwest participants, point to that 14 of them were the target of the no sabo label, bystanders 25, general conversation 10, and social media user 26. And so this is to say that almost 20% of participants, their first exposure to the no sabo label was them being called no sabo themselves. And I'll show a couple of not case studies, but I'll show a couple of examples in a little bit that kind of get at these initial reactions that the targets had to being called no sabo. So getting to the reported reasons for the label. So why did people, or what were the reported reasons to why somebody was being called a no sabo kid? So only 49%, or sorry, only 49 participants. So this is 65.3% of the Southwest participants reported a specific reason within their answers for why the target was being labeled no sabo. And so you can see the specific instances on the right, but kind of trying to group these things together. So the way we've kind of started to think about how to group these different types of reported reasons together is to think about a continuum of Spanish ability. So on one hand, we have participants who are able to produce Spanish. Then on another side, we have participants who are able to understand Spanish but may not speak it. And then we have participants who do not understand and do not speak Spanish. So within this, the majority of the targets had some production ability in Spanish. So some of them were specific linguistic features, for example, and this had to do with a lexical gap, some morphosyntactic feature, some phonetic feature, or saying the iconic phrase no sabo within a conversation. This was when participants labeled that there was a specific linguistic reason why somebody was labeled a no sabo kid. For the next category, can't speak about quote unquote not perfectly. These included things like they can't translate, they don't speak well, it's not proper Spanish, and they generally just struggle in Spanish, which struggle was a word that was used kind of frequently, not here in the data, but kind of overall. It was one that was a label that was often said. Then we get into participants who can't understand or can't speak Spanish. So this doesn't. So those where doesn't speak Spanish, and then they respond in English when addressed in Spanish, and that was 20% of the data. And they can't understand Spanish, which was about 8% of the data. So now getting to the quantitative results, again, these are just selected means that I wanted to bring in because they kind of highlight some of the general trends that we're seeing throughout the data. So just as a reminder, these were all on a Likert scale from 1, which is strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree. And so we have factor 1, which is this idea of assimilation into whiteness, this racialized component to the no sabo label. And there wasn't much strong agreement amongst participants. So we got 2 questions here. For example, I think that no sabo kids are too Americanized with a mean value of 2.84. So this was kind of between the disagree and neither agree nor disagree, which was 3 in our survey. It was within that range. The next one, I think that no sabo kids are too assimilated to U.S. culture. So this was 2.75 was the mean within our participants from the Southwest. However, with factor 2, which has to do with the lack of Spanish, there was fairly wide agreement amongst participants. And I'll kind of highlight this too when we talk about the preliminary general results for all the data. So these were some of the questions I chose to kind of highlight here. So no sabo kids have poor grammar in Spanish. That was 4. So that was the mean was 4. So that's an agree value. They have poor vocabulary in Spanish, almost a 4 as well. They're not fluent in Spanish with a mean of 3.88, and then they have poor pronunciation in Spanish, which is 3.79. So it seems to be the case that a lot of our participants are agreeing that the no sabo label has a linguistic component to it, while something like factor 1, assimilation to whiteness, is a little bit more negotiable. Some people, they believe that yes, it is, and then other people believe that it doesn't have that racialized component. So factor 3 for personal evaluation of no sabo kid, and factor 4 future behavior toward no sabo kids. There was no strong agreement amongst the participants. So as you can see here, with a mean of 3.69, that no sabo kids are intelligent. So again, 3 being neither agree nor disagree, and 4 being agree. Confidence almost at 3. It's almost at least the mean. It's all either agree nor disagree. And then future behavior towards no sabo kids. Again, there was not a strong agreement, but you can see some of the mean values here that I would call someone no sabo kid to their face if I thought they were one. I would feel ashamed if a child of mine was a no sabo kid, and I would tell other people to stop calling that person a no sabo. So getting at the preliminary results that we have, again, data analysis and collection is actually ongoing, but these are kind of some of the results I wanted to highlight here because I think they're interesting. And they say this evaluation of the no sabo label is actually something that is mediated by some social factors. Specifically, we're looking at region BLP score. So again, this is their language dominance and their score for the critical language awareness. So as the BLP scores increase, that is, participants are more English dominant, and also as their critical awareness scores increase, so they have a higher level of critical awareness. For factor 1, again, this assimilation into whiteness, they actually have a lower perception of no sabo kids as being too whitewashed or too Americanized. So as English dominance increases, as critical awareness increases as well, they have a lower perception that there's a racialized component to the no sabo label. Or at least that's something that they do not believe, that no sabo kids are too whitewashed or too Americanized. Interesting though is the reverse for personal evaluation. So they actually evaluated no Sabo kids actually more negatively. So as English dominance increases, as critical awareness increases, they view no Sabo kids as less friendly, less sincere, and less intelligent. And for factor four, they were indicating that they were more likely to not engage in language shaming. So they wouldn't mind if their kid was a no Sabo kid. They would tell someone else to stop calling someone else a no Sabo. So that those participants, as their dominance increased and as their critical awareness scores also increase, they exhibited that behavior within their survey data. But interestingly, this idea of a lack of Spanish, this linguistic component to the no Sabo label, this was one that was not affected by the language dominance or critical awareness. So it seems to be the case that participants are in agreement, at least in our survey data, they're in agreement that the no Sabo label has most of the core feature of it is this linguistic component, and that is highlighting a deficiency, some quote unquote deficiency in Spanish. So with their overall experiences, the participants reports to the label, it was very varied. I haven't put in all the adjectives here, but here were some ones that kept on popping up in the data. Positive, that they thought it was funny. They thought the situation where someone else was called no Sabo kid, it was really humorous, it was really funny, it was a joke. Participants, some also reported finding it relatable. Most memorably, some participants were saying, hey, actually, that describes me, and that makes me feel part of the community. That there are people like me, there are people in my situation. There's actually so many of us that we have a label that's used to describe our experiences. So that was found in the data. Other people just kind of like a shrug emoji. They just didn't really have any opinion of it, and they didn't really report having strong feelings either way about the use of the term. And then, of course, not surprisingly, considering primary research on no Sabo has really focused on like the negative aspects of it. Participants felt ashamed, upset, insulted, embarrassed, and disconnected from their heritage and from their identity. And then I will say too that it wasn't completely black or white. So some participants had both positive and negative experiences. So I kind of wanted to highlight some of those situations with 3 particular cases from the Southwest participants that kind of showed this duality of the no Sabo label, that there were some positive experiences and then also some negative ones. So this first one comes from participant 50, female from Texas, and she heard it in 2018. So she reported that I'm pretty sure that my friends were making fun of my poor Spanish because at the time I barely knew the language. So basically, it was the effect of one of her friends said to something to the effect of, "Oh, you're probably one of those people that say no Sabo." And then the participant reports that she remembers being offended and said something like in that situation, "No, I'm not that stupid." So trying to push back on having her labeled as the no Sabo. And then when we asked her about what she thought it meant within the context, she said, "I immediately knew what it meant because I knew where the word stemmed from." So this kind of speaks to us. It kind of speaks to the iconicity of the phrase, that many participants are familiar with how it's a regularized form of saber in the first person singular present tense. And this wasn't the case for all survey participants. Some of them reported being confused by the use of the term and the use of the meaning, but then others were very much like, hey, this is something I said as a kid, or this is something I've heard a lot before. Some participants were able to immediately kind of understand what it meant in the context with being it, even if it was their first time hearing it. And then this participant also reported that I remember I definitely laughed because it's a funny joke, but on the inside I felt defensive. I didn't want to be seen as a no Sabo, but I didn't want people to think I was stupid, so I laughed along with it. So this really speaks to something that we're also seeing in the data, is that there's peer pressure in these situations to accept the use of the no Sabo label as a joke. And in fact, some participants find it funny, as this participant mentioned here. But at the same time, too, she wanted to direct it her way. She said, quote, "I remember at the time it was funny to me. I also found it relatable, but I didn't like the fact that it could refer to me, partly because it was true." So the use of this label also kind of brings to the surface linguistic insecurities that have been bubbling, or very, participants frequently express sometimes. And this label kind of brings that aspect out, as this participant is highlighting with her survey data. So now we have participant 105 who heard it in 2020, and she said that uncles who were close in age to her would insult me for not knowing a word. So my uncles would just call me, the no Sabo label, and I would feel upset, obviously. And then at the same time, too, she said it was funny at first. Like, it was funny when uncles who are my age were saying it, but then older generations used it and it didn't feel right, is her quote that she used. And this kind of exemplifies the feeling that several participants expressed in our survey, that it could be used as a joke in between friends, but when it's used between classmates who didn't know each other very well, or by people that classmates they didn't like, or by people who are older or perceived to be more proficient in Spanish, the no sabo label takes on a different one. It takes on one that has very negative overtones to it. And this participant also reported that I might have told my boyfriend about it after she heard it for the first time, and I may have cried and I felt disconnected with my heritage. So some people described how being labeled this way made them feel even more isolated from the community and more disconnected from that part of their identity. That is, the use of the label in certain contexts has this very powerful effect that can exacerbate feelings of linguistic insecurity and a lack of cultural authenticity that some of these participants feel. And this last case to exemplify kind of some of the larger trends that we're seeing within this data, this participant heard it in 2019. In this particular interaction, he reported hearing it at work in which he was a cashier or a bagger, and he was having another interaction with a cashier. And he explains to that cashier that how his parents are from two different Spanish-speaking countries. And the cashier asks him if he can speak Spanish, and he says no, quote unquote, or sorry, quote, honestly, no. I wish I could, but I never learned Spanish as a kid. And then the cashier says, oh, I see. So you're like a no sabo kid. So this participant reports that I felt mixed emotions. On the one hand, it felt reassuring to know that there are enough people like me who are Hispanic who couldn't speak Spanish, that people created a term for it. But over time, I did feel like it became degrading. And then within this interaction, he also reported that somebody pushed back and said, honestly, this participant reported, sorry, honestly, looking back, it did mean a lot to me that somebody spoke up. That was really the first time I had given me reassurance that my situation was not as bad. So this, not too many people in the survey reported instances in which a conversation participant, other than the target, kind of pushed back against the use of this term. But by sticking up for him, this was an important moment that kind of lessened the stigma that he had that was being attached to the label. But at the same time, too, not being able to speak Spanish always makes me feel so guilty and that I couldn't live up to the expectations. So this repeated use of the label directed his way contributed to negative feelings because he reported hearing it over and over again, especially directed to his way. This included feelings of guilt and demoralizing when trying to speak Spanish to somebody else. And the participant reported that in additional interactions, this is something that came up a lot. So now moving to the discussion. So what does all the survey data tell us? Well, it tells us, first of all, constructing the no sabo timeline, that this label was actually circulating in face-to-face interactions before online. So previous research has reported that it's mostly, or that its likely origin perhaps was, online, especially on TikTok in 2020. But our data is showing that people reported hearing it in school, family, work, social events, well before it made its jump to an online space. And so, like I say here, like the use of this term has definitely been mediatized. Like people are using it online. It's in mass media as well, and this especially picked up during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, two quotes here from participants kind of point to this idea that yeah, it was a term that was circulating, perhaps, and it was, according to our survey participants, it was circulating in a face-to-face context well before it came online. But when it did come online, especially during the pandemic, when, like most of us, as the first participant says here, participant 42, when I spent a lot of time on social media due to the pandemic. So people are doom scrolling during the pandemic. They come across this term, they make videos on it, they engage with it. Then we know how the algorithms work, that they start seeing more and more and more and more of the no sabo videos. So, so it seems to be the case that yes, the term was circulating in an offline context, face to face. But when it did get into the mediatized online space, that it was just rocket fuel. It was just something that helped spread the term, and people gained a lot more awareness of it. So that they actually point to the fact that it was probably the pandemic, being online during the pandemic that helped spread the term. So another idea we're working with that we're seeing with some of the data, not all the data, but a couple of examples, is this possible idea that this term may have originated as part of nicknaming practices that exist within Hispanic communities and within Hispanic families. So this comes from two participants specifically. So this first participant who heard it in 2016. So he says, I was sitting with my family as they were having a conversation. The topic turns to me, my cousins, and my sister's level of Spanish. My grandma jokingly calls me a no sabo since I constantly said that instead of no say. So again, this idea that no sabo is very iconic, and especially iconic of child language acquisition. So if it's iconic of child language acquisition, perhaps this term first started circulating within families in which it was a nickname or something that was commented on by participants who were no longer children, but were saying this phrase instead of no say. And then another participant from 2019 who reported that her family laughed at her after mispronouncing a word. She said, hearing that made me upset and frustrated because I almost felt like it was invalidating my skill and effort I was doing to improve my Spanish at the time. She goes on to say that used to say no sabo as a kid, and then I kept hearing no sabo, something that came from a little grammatical error that turned into me being the butt of the joke. So again, possibly trying to think of how and why this term originated, possibly has to do with nicknaming practices. Our data also highlights that I want to emphasize here is that it is very context dependent. So there does seem to be a core meaning that has to do with a supposed linguistic deficiency, but it has a wide range of meanings that are only gained through discourse, through interaction, through negotiation. And that sometimes it was perceived to be initially funny, but then perhaps on deeper reflection, some participants began to see the implications of it and began to now have some good feelings about kind of what the label was and what was being applied or who was being applied to. And so this idea of critical awareness is kind of exemplified by this participant that we saw earlier. This participant wrote a lot on his survey, and then he wrote that this is more tangential, but it's not necessarily referring, I don't know what it's referring to. It could be the survey or it could be other things going on, but I couldn't tell what it was. Gave me some clarity as why I never learned Spanish this young. He goes on to say, he goes on to talk about how his mother took him out of bilingual classes and put him in English only classes. And then he says, quote, that revelation gave me a lot of reason to why I was the way I am now. So this idea of, it wasn't necessarily my fault. I didn't have exposure to Spanish. And I remember only speaking English, and I also never got to interact with other Spanish speakers or others speaking Spanish. So he begins to wonder in the survey, and you can see that in his data, that he begins to wonder what his life could be like when it was different. It could be different. And he kind of critiques the way that his family now engages in language shaming with him. So it was a decision my mom made, and I don't blame her, but I wish people just give me more leeway. I didn't have that much exposure to Spanish. So of course I speak the way that I do. I didn't have access to the language or not that much access to it. So this goes to getting into like pedagogical implications, this kind of awareness of the larger social political context and other types of, language shift and maintenance. There's individual, familial, community, and societal factors. So getting awareness that it's all four of those factors that affect how somebody speaks through critical language awareness. And this is something that I've seen my own work. I won't read the quotes here, but we can come back to them if anyone's interested. But this is something I'm also seeing in my work on employing critical language awareness in class with bilinguals and how they walk away from the class understanding that, yes, part of it's an individual factor, but there's a lots of other societal and community factors and social political contexts that influence how somebody speaks. And oftentimes, and a lot of times, it has to do with power structures and power dynamics within society. So presenting now to conclude just some of the preliminary findings that we found. So how did and why did this label emerge? It seems to be that the no sabo label is the latest iteration of racial linguistic labeling, possibly through nicknaming practices because the iconicity of the phrase no sabo, and that's again tied to language or child language acquisition. It spread. It was definitely being used face to face, but it seemed to be really spread awareness. Definitely awareness of the term began to spread online and social media during and post-pandemic period. The key components have to do with the perceived deficit in Spanish language abilities, and it's also mediated by some social factors too. This not the language deficiencies in Spanish language, but other things like if it has a racialized component to it, negative evaluations, and people's perception that they're more likely to engage in language shaming or not. Those are all tied, at least in our survey data, to social factors. So I want to thank you all for the opportunity to come talk about this research that's ongoing. I want to give a special shout out to my research assistant, Caitlin, who was really instrumental in helping me kind of organize the qualitative data, so I was able to actually sit down with it and look at it. And I want to thank everyone too who has helped distribute and take the survey. And as I mentioned, I'm still actively recruiting participants. So if you have any students that you might want to send this survey to, again, they earn $15 that they can redeem for a gift card. Just shoot me an email and I'll be happy to share the flyer with you that you can distribute to your students. And I do have to mention our funding sources. So this research has been funded by the Race and Ethnic Studies Institute and the Glasscock Center for Humanities Research at Texas A&M University. So thank you all very much for your time, and I look forward to answering any sort of questions or comments that you may have, suggestions too.
Bravo, muy bien, muy interesante. Sí, por favor nos mandas la información para compartir con nuestros estudiantes.
Sí, claro que sí, con mucho
Sí, la
gusto.
podemos compartir. Y si hay preguntas, adelante, por favor. ¿Quién quiere empezar?
Damián.
Adelante.
Pues gracias por la muy buena presentación, me encantó y pues hay tanto que podríamos hablar respecto al proyecto bien hecho, abarca muchos diferentes factores, tópicos, aproximaciones. Pero también me fascina el lado de Critical Language Awareness
Mm,
y pues primero me encanta porque enfatiza que los estudiantes llegan con un nivel de
sí,
CLA, o sea, siempre estoy promoviendo la idea de que no son tabula rasa, o sea, no
no, para
somos
nada.
tontos, o sea, la gente latina ya tenemos algo de CLA por nuestra
Mm,
experiencia en la sociedad,
totalmente.
pero entonces, a ver si tiene ideas de like obviously in heritage language classes, it's much more than just teaching grammar. It's much more than even just teaching culture. That's not enough. How do you see, could you talk little bit more specifically about how you see your work coming into like maybe a heritage language class or even like mixed classes?
Direct discussion, the no sabo label.
Mhm.
To give you a concrete example, so I'm teaching a class. It's not a heritage class, but I'm teaching Spanish sociolinguistics for undergrads. So we spent a whole week talking about no sabo kids. So I had them get online to see kind of what features were being registered. We were talking about enregistrement. I had them get online, talk about features of enregistrements. And then I gave them data, actually the transcripts from my study that's forthcoming on the Caso Cerrado episode, and had them isolate moments of stylization.
Mhm.
So it's having those conversations and like actual critical analysis of how, okay, so then I had them take a step back. Okay, so this is the episode that's been portrayed. Like, how do you think it's received? Like some of them had experience, like, oh yeah, I saw this online, it's a meme, right? And others like, yeah, it's kind of harsh, like without knowing like the full episode context of how she, like Luna comes to the store and doesn't want to speak in Spanish and says this is America, speak English. If you just see this part of the episode where it's this older woman who's screaming at this younger woman for not speaking Spanish, you could walk away with a lot of negative feelings and perception of that. So in the classroom, I use these different types of examples to interrogate this paradox of, well, some people are using the no sabo label to try to promote the younger generation who speaks more Spanish. But research has also shown that feelings of linguistic insecurity, feelings of language shaming, is that really the best way to motivate these people to speak more Spanish?
Mhm.
We take a look at that in the classroom. So that's something that can be easily adaptable for a heritage classroom. This episode, like I mentioned, I don't know how many of you have seen it before, but it was all over. I mean, it was all over my social media. And again, this
Mhm.
probably has to do with the algorithm, but students do come to the classroom having an idea that they've seen some sort of these mediatized examples, and that's a great opportunity in the classroom to actually critically analyze them.
Gracias. Very cool.
Gracias.
Awesome. Great
Adelante,
work.
doctora López y luego María Domínguez.
Um, Sam or Sean, I was wondering if you could share that your email again.
Oh, yes. Yes, I will drop it in the chats.
And then also, I wanted to make two comments. One was whether, or one was that um, some of the appropriation of the term as a term of empowerment that follows a trend that has continued since the civil rights movement,
Mhm.
where, Black power, brown power, and certain terms that were used, even Chicano movement, terms that were used as terms of you know, disparagingly became terms of empowerment. So there's a long history to that. And believe that is what's happened with this because my own daughter I know has used that term as a self descriptor. Um, but also, the other thing I wanted to say was that before the term existed, there is also a longer history of decades of people who are Hispanic or and other people assume they speak Spanish, of saying as a source of pride, I don't speak Spanish. So before the term no sabo existed, I believe that just saying I don't speak Spanish with a sense of pride was label that was, but it is ambiguous because, in contrast to some of the other terms that, like through the civil rights movement, some of those terms had to do with skin color, for example, which is something that is completely out of their control. Um, but choosing not to learn Spanish, I think, is also, has been a source of pride for some people who have just said, I don't speak Spanish and have, but I think it's an ambiguous thing.
So that kind of made me think of a couple different things. So I will highlight work that's going to be ongoing if I'm going to share my screen again. It's going to be work that's going to be hopefully part of our special issue. All these papers still have to pass through peer review, but I want to focus on two different papers here that hopefully will be forthcoming. So we have conceptualization, overlap, and distinctions between racial linguistic labels. So we actually have a contributor who is working on how do people understand the differences between no sabo, pocho, other different racial linguistic terms. And this person is working specifically on that piece to kind of, it's part of a long iteration of these terms, but kind of like how are people conceptualizing similarities and differences between them? So that will be one paper, hopefully that will be accepted. And this last one, though, talking about this reappropriation. Yes, absolutely. We've seen this in many different minoritized communities, both here in the United States and elsewhere, where slurs are being reclaimed by the community themselves. And that's what somebody's going to be working on as well. They're going to be working on this, how people are contesting this label, and also how it's turning into a sort of pride in being labeled no sabo. So I just want to highlight those two different empirical work that hopefully will be forthcoming in the next couple of months or so.
Muchas gracias. María y luego la doctora Hernández, por favor.
Okay. First, thank you so much for that presentation. I feel like it was really informative. I had a question that kind of like como que se me ocurrió when you were going through slide 25, I believe, because it's something I've been thinking of where somebody quoted, I laugh because it's funny, but on the inside I felt defensive, and so on and so forth. And so now I kind of wondering like where's the line between humor and offensive in
Yeah.
this no sabo content? But
Mhm.
then also how do factors like maybe proficiency, identity, sense of belonging in the community, such as who thinks it's funny and why, who doesn't think it's funny and why, can shape perceptions of that label.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So, where my head is at with this right now, and I still need to work through it a little bit, but in another life, I did a lot of research on mock politeness. So when I initially got into grad school, I was really doing research on mock politeness. So it's like the use of insults and terms that are insulting to have a pro-social function. So I specifically did a study that was published in 2017 on drag queens and how drag queens use reading as a way to it's a very pro-social function within that community. So and that specifically, my participants were telling me that it was something that we pick up something else that another queen is self-conscious about, and then we direct our comments towards her based on that. And it's a way to kind of like build up, and one of the quotes I have is, it's a way to build up armor. It's a way to, you're going to get these comments elsewhere, so let's verbally joust so you're able to respond in situations in which it's not funny or it's not pro-social, it's actually anti-social. So that kind of makes me think of this a little bit. I think the line has to do a lot with different perceptions. And this is something that's key within mock and politeness research. That line between mock and politeness and genuine, it's a very slippery slope. If somebody in that conversation evaluates it as negative, some are going to have a negative and a genuine impoliteness interpretation of it, while others are going to think it has a more pro-social function. So I think there with this, and what I'm happy we asked those types of questions to get at how people felt about the term, to kind of understand, okay, whether they thought it was a joke or not. But yeah, at the same time too, they thought it was funny, but then I felt defensive, and I didn't want to be seen this way. So long story short, that's kind of where my head is at right now. I'm still working through those ideas, but I think mock and politeness it might be a way to kind of understanding a little bit more of the nuances with this label.
Gracias. Adelante, doctora Hernández.
Muchas gracias por la presentación. Estoy un poco enferma. Quisiera saber qué opinas de ese juego que es muy popular últimamente, basado en los Es parecido a No Sabo Kid,
Yo
pero es
Sabo,
Yo Sabo.
Yo Sabo se llama el juego.
Ya, yo
Yeah,
quisiera
yeah.
saber si tú crees que eso refuerza el concepto negativo o eso ayuda a romper el concepto negativo. Y mi pregunta es porque lo hemos usado en el programa de Heritage.
Mm.
Y no sé que envié tu información para este research a nuestros estudiantes. No sé cuántos participaron, pero este momento es muy significativo saber que hay estudiantes en UNM sintiéndose así, ¿verdad? Entonces quisiera saber qué piensas de este juego.
Ya, qué buena pregunta. Mi reacción inicial es que mucho el juego creo que se basa en esta perspectiva de una como like a linguistic deficiency without in terms of like actually having sat down with all the cards. I actually have it in my office y creo que un día voy a hacer un análisis de las tarjetas de Diosdado para saber okay, cuántas tarjetas sí perpetúan los mitos del bilingüismo las ideologías lingüísticas negativas que afectan a los bilingües. Pero creo que you can maybe do that and, have that game. And because like, like you said, algunas personas se identifican con la etiqueta, ¿verdad? But then also maybe compare at the end with kind of a critical discussion about bilingualism and about the range of abilities and kind of how this label um, may perpetuate an idea of linguistic deficiency in Spanish, but some people are reclaiming it. So have that conversation, that nuanced conversation that maybe it's not black or white. Maybe that's how the term started, but definitely some people are using it kind of more positively. So tener esas conversaciones en el salón de clase después de haber jugado el juego. Entonces, I think that might be a good way to kind of go about it, or just my initial thoughts about it.
Muy buena
Thank you.
recomendación. Gracias. Adelante, Daisy.
Daisy, hi.
Hola, Sean.
¿Cómo estás?
Bien, bien. Muchas gracias por tu presentación. It's so awesome to see it and to see the term no sabo approached kind of in a systematic way because as a heritage speaker myself, I've grown up hearing this term in my community. Now that I'm teaching heritage courses in my classes as well, and I know we've discussed how to approach this topic in the classroom, but I was wondering, and I don't know if you have an answer for this because I think it's quite complex, but do you have any recommendations for how to address this at the community level or at the familial level? Because, for instance, last time I had a family party, I told one of my cousins, "Oh yeah, I'm studying a PhD in Spanish linguistics," and he's like, "That's so great, so that you don't become a no sabo or like you don't want to be a no sabo."
Yeah.
And so I'm used to hearing these comments, but it's like, how much do I want to address this at a carne asada right now with a cousin that I see
Right,
maybe like
fair.
once a month
Yeah.
or even less than that? But they're so damaging, and you almost want to address them because they're gonna go talk to some other little cousins that are still forming their opinions of the world, and it's something, es como una batalla que tengo yo misma cuando estoy en estas familias o en estas reuniones familiares. No sé qué hacer, es como, tampoco me quiero posicionar como, oh, la que ya está estudiando y ya
Right.
sabe todo. No sé,
Yeah.
entonces, ¿cómo le podemos hacer? ¿Tienes alguna sugerencia?
Yeah, my initial thoughts are, yeah, it completely depends on the individual, right? And whether they want to address those comments or not. But within the sort of the class, it's something that we can do with critical language awareness, right? It's all about empowering student agency, but it's also providing them the opportunities to be able to make decisions, right? So I can imagine something of, taking a look at the survey data and look at the specific instances, and maybe that's a good idea. Maybe something I should look at doing and kind of coming up with scenarios in which people have heard the no sabo label and then present that in class and do a people role play, right? So have students role play, okay, like how would you respond in this situation if you wanted to? So, and I mean, this is something that you can do with your students. Like you can do this too. You can do this survey with your students to kind of see kind of how they've been exposed to the term, and from that come up with different types of situations to present to them and kind of practice it in class. So again, that's giving them the opportunity to put their critical language awareness into action. within the classroom. But at the end of the day, if they want to respond to that situation or not, that's completely on them. And it has to do with many different types of factors that I don't think we as the instructors should impose upon them because we don't know their personal situation. So those have been my initial thoughts about what we can do in the classroom with respect to this, the pedagogical applications of this type of research.
Muchas gracias. ¿Alguien más tiene alguna pregunta o comentario? Muchas gracias, doctor McKinnon,
A ustedes.
por compartir. Vamos a compartir este video. Gracias a todos. Y si tienen una pregunta o comentario, podemos mandarle un mensaje directo, ¿verdad?
Sí, claro.
Y por favor, nos comparte la encuesta y la información para poder compartir también nosotros.
Okay, excellent. I'll make sure to do that.
Y nos vemos en Georgetown en 2 semanas.
En 2 semanas. Uf, yes, 2 semanas.
Muchas gracias. Gracias a todos por venir.
Yeah, gracias a todos. Gracias.
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 Adiós.
Adiós. Adiós.